YouTube, and welcome to part 2 of making these sheepskin boots. In the last video we made the pattern. If you missed that video, click on the little icon there, or check the link in the description down below. In this video we're going to prepare the leather, ready for sewing. For the soles of these boots I'm just going to be using 2 layers of regular leather, and I made these using offcuts. And I also used offcuts of sheepskin. If you're going to do that too, make sure you get offcuts and not scraps. And if you're in any doubt, you can contact the seller and try and get a gauge for the size of each piece. Now bear in mind I have tiny feet, so I had plenty of leather to work with. A good idea would be to make the pattern first. You can spread it out and see how much space it takes up, and you can gauge from that how much leather you need. And you can decide for yourself whether to get offcuts or just buy it by the metre. Also, get more than you think you need. It's a good idea to have more so you can cut more pieces if you make a mistake, which I did. So let's take a quick look at the tools we'll be using, and we'll get started. Here are the tools that I'll be using in this project. I have a leather working tool. It comes with different attachments for doing different things, but for this project I'm only using the groover. This cuts a groove in the leather for the stitches to sit into, so you end up with a flat surface. It has an adjustable guide, so you can adjust it to the width you want. So you hold the guide on the edge of the leather, and it will keep your groove an even distance from the edge. Since leather is hard to stitch through, I pre-punch my stitching holes using these chisels. Obviously, the more prongs your chisel has, the more holes you can do in one go. This one is great for going in straight lines. But if you're going around a curve, you might have to use a chisel with fewer prongs. I also use this 4mm hole punch for making lace holes. And finally, I used a newly sharpened pair of scissors. You can get a multi-tool like this, or a set of tools, online. I got all of these on Amazon, but you can also get them on eBay and Etsy. For the sole, I'll be using this brown leather. I place my first pattern piece on and I trace around in chalk. I would normally do this in pen, but I've misplaced it. I trace all around the edge and make sure to mark out all the notches. I then flip the pattern piece over so that I have one left sole and one right sole, and do the same thing again, tracing around the outside and marking the notches. Do the same for the bottom sole piece, tracing around the outside, marking the notch, and flipping the piece over. Having relocated my pen, I mark out all the notches before all the chalk wears off. I then cut all these pieces out using a sharp pair of scissors. Now it's time to start cutting into the sheepskin. I place it fleece side down, and I want to avoid any areas that are thin or have no fleece on the outside. And I place down my pattern pieces. I draw around the boot side twice of the pattern facing up, and twice of the pattern facing down, so that each boot has an inner and outer side. I also marked out 2 of the cuffs, and though I didn't show it on camera, I marked out the boot front twice, again remembering to flip the pattern piece over so that I have a left and right side. Now I cut these pieces out using a sharp pair of scissors. And as I was cutting out my pieces, I noticed something I missed earlier. As I was drawing out my pattern pieces, I dropped my pen and it bounced, leaving several marks, 2 of them in one of my side pieces. But luckily I had enough sheepskin left over to draw the pattern out again. Once all my pieces are cut out, I cut away the fleece where the seams are going to be. I cut the fleece about 1/4 of an inch in from the edge, only where there are going to be seams. This is just to make my life easier when it comes to punching holes and stitching the pieces together. I next give the fleece a bit of a trim, tapering it towards the inside so that it's short at the edge and gets longer towards the middle. This is to reduce bulk around the seams. I've done this all around the side and front of the boot front. I've also done this on the front and back side and the bottom of the boot side. And I've cut 1/4 of an inch into the top of the boot, but leaving the fleece long. This is so that it will blend in with the cuff. And on the cuff, I cut 1/4 of an inch in along both sides and on the bottom, leaving the fleece long. Next, I'm going to work on the smaller outer sole. I take my leather groover and I set it to 1/8 of an inch. And I'm going to use this to groove a line 1/8 of an inch in from the edge. This will make a little groove for the stitches to sit in, but first I'll glue the inner and outer soles together. I've drawn an outline on the larger inner sole, where the smaller outer sole will sit. And I'm going to use this as a guide. And I'm going to use some leather glue to glue these two pieces together, keeping inside the outlines on the outer sole. And applying the glue to the whole top side of the outer sole. I then carefully line these pieces up and stick down the smaller sole within the outline on the larger sole. Once the pieces are aligned, I press that down and I wipe off any excess glue with a damp cloth. And while the glue dries and cures, I want to make sure the pieces stay pressed together, so I add some weight. Now comes the fun part of the project, hitting things with a hammer. I'm going to pre-punch the stitching holes, and for that I'm using these 3mm chisels. I'm working on a sturdy surface, and I'm putting a scrap piece of leather underneath the working leather to protect the work surface. I'm going to punch 1 row of holes along the bottom where I'll be stitching the boot to the sole. I'm using the 6-prong chisel for this, and starting about 3mm from the edge, I begin to punch holes. Whenever I punch a new set of holes, I put the first prong into the last hole that I punched, so that they stay consistently 3mm apart. I punch a single row of holes along the bottom and top edges of each side boot piece, and along the front edge of each boot front piece, and 1 row of holes along the sides and bottom of the cuff. Next, I take my 2-prong chisel. I'm going to punch 2 rows of holes, 3mm apart, along the sides and back of the boot. And I do the same for the side seams on the boot front. Now for the lace holes, I mark where the holes are going to be, 1 inch apart, 1/2 inch in from the edge. I'm using a 4mm hole punch and my nylon head hammer. I move the fleece to the side behind the marking, and I find some beeswax on the tip of the punch, helps it go through easier. I place the punch over my first marking and punch through. Now all my lace holes are punched, I'm ready to start dyeing the leather. This sheepskin is just a little too flesh-coloured for my taste. I'm using this suede dye in a light brown. I've done a test on a scrap piece of skin, and it's not what I'd call light brown. In hindsight, the colour I was thinking of is more of a tan, but I quite like this colour. It goes with more of my stuff, so I'm just going to roll with it. I'll be dyeing the boot sides and the boot front. I will leave the cuff because that's going to be folded over and we won't see it anyway. I've put some masking tape around the edges to protect the fleece. And I'm going to brush the leather with a stiff bristled brush to raise the nap. And before I start dyeing, I'm going to put on some gloves, because this stuff will stain your skin. Using the applicator, I spread a thin, even layer all over. I make sure I get into the lace holes and along the edges. And while I let those pieces dry, I can now go back to working on the soles, on which the glue has now dried and cured. I'm going to punch more stitching holes in the groove I made earlier, and along the edge of the larger inner sole. I place the chisel in the groove and I work around the sole, making sure to punch through both layers. And when that's done, I punch along the edge of the sole. I find the notch I marked earlier, and this is where I'm going to punch my first hole. I then work all the way around the sole until I come back to the beginning. Now that the dye has dried, it's time for another coat. I did 3 coats altogether, and while it's fully dried, I brush the pieces again to fluff them up a bit and take off any excess dye that sat on the top. Finally, I'm going to give the fleece a little bit of a trim, as it's longer in some parts than in others, and I want to cut it down to around 10mm, where the thickest, woolliest bit of the fleece is. I don't take off very much, somewhere between 2 to 5mm, and on the boot sides, I taper it upwards so it's longer at the top, and that will blend in with the cuff. Now all our pieces are dyed, punched and ready for sewing, but that's going to have to wait until the next video. If you don't want to miss that, don't forget to subscribe, and if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. You can follow me on social media @SandyCreature, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!